Lucy Parsons is a name that many may have not heard of, and there's a reason for that. Her voice was repeatedly stifled and silenced by the US government, both during her life and following her death in 1942. She was a Black female activist in Chicago who advocated throughout her 89 years of life for the working class, for voting rights, and for racial justice. She wrote these words: "When women take hold of a great and crying evil, you may expect revolution. Not necessarily a revolution of blood and destruction, yet not necessarily one of peace." Women have been fighting for injustice for centuries with the power of our voices, speaking out courageously even in the face of mammoth forces that seek to shame and silence those who do so. Today, there is a revolution underway in how we talk about sexual boundaries and power, and in how we as a culture respond to sexual harassment and assault. It doesn't have a name exactly, but it is referred to by the hashtag #MeToo. Me too. And I know many of you too. The statistic is that 1 in 4 women and gender nonconforming people have been sexually assaulted or harassed in their lifetime. But as I watch the Me Too movement unfold and hear the stories of friends and family and members of this congregation, it almost seems like it's close to 4 in 4. We know that people of all genders are affected, and we also know that certain communities are disproportionately affected. According to a 2015 survey, 47% of transgender people report being sexually assaulted at some point in their lives. 47%. Women in marginalized communities are also more likely to be victims of sexual assault and to face numerous challenges when it comes to reporting these incidents. Now, I will not subject you to stories here this morning because I suspect that almost everyone in this room has one, either from your own life or from someone who you know and love. But to speak out and to say, "Me too," is a great risk. It risks vulnerability and pain. It's a risk of being known. We risk being not believed, but also we risk being believed. We risk so much, including leaving the shadows behind and stepping into healing light. And it is to risk being brave. So I want to invite you here this morning in this sanctuary to take this risk with me. If you have experienced sexual assault or harassment or harm of any kind, I invite you to stand or to raise your hand. Let's pause just a moment to witness the power of this visual, of so many in this room rising and raising their hands. And the thing about this is that no one of us is rising alone. We share in each other's courage and bravery. You can be seated. I know the image of so many rising here in this sanctuary will stay with me, and I imagine it will stay with you as well. It is an act of courage and witness and solidarity to do this. I also want to light this candle for those in this room who are not yet ready to rise and say "Me too," but who know the truth of their story. And you, too, can share in the courage and the bravery of this community and of the worldwide community of people who are saying "Me too," in both private and in very public ways as well. Thank you for joining me in taking that risk. The Me Too movement, of which we are all a part in some way, did not begin last fall, as it may seem. Its roots go back to 1997, when Tarana Burke, an activist in New York, sat across from a 13-year-old girl who shared with her her story of sexual abuse. Ms. Burke was speechless and couldn't bring herself at the time to say, "Me too." Nor did she have access to adequate resources to help support this young woman. But the experience stayed with her, and 10 years later she created Just Be Incorporated, which was a nonprofit that helps victims of sexual assault and harassment like that young girl. Burke started to use the phrase "Me Too" to describe the movement that she sought to build. Now fast forward to last October. The actress Alyssa Milano, in response to the flurry of allegations against Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein, tweeted out, "Me too. If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted," she said, "write me too in reply to this tweet." Now her tweet was shared more than 12 million times in the first 24 hours and has since prompted over 85 million similar posts on social media, opening up a larger conversation beyond social media about the role of and response to sexual harassment and assault in our culture. During the Golden Globe Awards, where this got a lot of attention, the New York Times ran an ad which went like this. "He said, she said, he said, she said, he said, she said, she said, she said, she said, she said. The truth has power. The truth will not be threatened. The truth has a voice." Now, it began with the words "he said, she said," a phrase commonly used to refer to the way victims of misconduct have been dismissed or discouraged from speaking the truth. But it ends with "she said, she said, she said, she said, she said," and so on, representing the flood of women who have shared their Me Too experiences since October. As the ad proclaims, truth has a voice. And that voice is not just in Hollywood. As the Time magazine article reminds us, the people who have broken their silence span all races, all income classes, all occupations, and virtually all corners of the globe. What has happened since October is the most recent chapter in a longer movement, which has been simmering and building with the leadership of courageous activists like Tarana Burke. And now, it seems, the simmer has turned to a boil. This is a revolution of the kind Lucy Parsons wrote about, not of blood and destruction, nor of peace, but of refusal. So what can we as a community of Unitarian Universalists, of religious progressives here in Dallas, learn from the courageous Me Too movement? As I look at it, I think there are 4 things that we need to pay attention to: who the silence breakers are, how the issue is defined, how the silence is broken, and the effect of breaking the silence. Who are the silence breakers? Well, many of the earliest gender discrimination cases, as well as many of the newer ones, were brought by women of color. The Me Too movement originated with a Black woman, Tarana Burke, and yet her efforts went largely unrecognized and unsupported on a wider scale by white feminists, until a celebrity used the same words and brought them to prominence. Numerous politicians with sordid histories of sexual misconduct have been elected to positions of power with the majority of white women voting for them. And some politicians have been voted out recently, in large part thanks to the majority of Black women voting against them. Never doubt that your vote matters. Progressive movements for social change have an unfortunate history of sometimes not recognizing or lifting up the contributions of women of color on whose shoulders we stand and whose behind-the-scenes organizing and activism has gotten us to where we are now. This was the case in the civil rights movement. It is the case today with Me Too. We must do a better job of following the leadership of women of color and supporting the ways that they are making and sustaining powerful and courageous movements for change. Now, how the issue at hand is defined and how lines are drawn is another important conversation that has emerged from the Me Too movement. There is a difference between harassment, assault, dirty jokes, and awkward non-consensual interactions. But all are inappropriate on some level. As Time magazine points out, norms evolve, and it's long past time for any culture to view harassment as acceptable. But there's a great deal at stake, they say, in how we assess these new boundaries. I'm proud to be part of a religious tradition that teaches our young people how to discern such boundaries, how to speak up for themselves, how to treat their bodies and others' bodies as sacred, and how to have healthy sexual relationships. And we do this through the Our Whole Lives curriculum, currently offered in 1st grade, 6th grade, 8th grade, recently for adults, and very soon for young adults. We are also seeking, as part of our Love First strategic plan, to expand such learning opportunities more widely across our city. My hope and prayer is that more people in our society will have access to such comprehensive sexuality education, and that it will over time shape the norms of what is healthy and unhealthy, acceptable and unacceptable. Breaking the silence about sexual harassment and assault is an act of tremendous courage, in part because of how shame and blame are thrown around. This is becoming increasingly clear as the Me Too movement grows and more women and people of all genders are speaking out. Some people ask, well, why did they wait so long to tell someone that they'd been assaulted? The dynamics around Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein are just one example of why such behavior remains in the cone of silence for so long. His behavior was considered an open secret to many in Hollywood and beyond, but people were too scared to say anything. Women who were mistreated by him were afraid to speak out because they feared retaliation, that he would crush them. Similarly, a 2016 study of women who work in the tech industry found that 60% of respondents had experienced unwanted sexual advances at work. And most of them did nothing because they worried that reporting the incidents would hurt their career, their reputation, and make them even more vulnerable. And when they did report the incidents, those in power did nothing about it. There is a very sad and a very real dynamic of self-blame among those who've experienced sexual assault and harassment. Multiple of Weinstein's accusers said, "If I were a strong woman, I would have fought back, but I didn't, so I felt responsible." When it feels like there's little recourse, sometimes the victims give up and blame themselves. Maya Angelou wrote the poem On the Pulse of Morning, which you heard earlier, for the occasion of Bill Clinton's presidential inauguration in 1993. Angelou herself is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, which she wrote about in I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. After this traumatic experience, she delved into the study and memorization of literature and poetry, and a friend suggested to her, encouraged that she learn to recite these poems, which actually helped to bring her out of a period of muteness in her life that had been brought about by the trauma. The irony that this poem was read at the inauguration of a president later accused of taking advantage of a young intern is not lost on me. In this poem, she writes, "Today the rock cries out to us, clearly, forcefully. Come, you may stand upon my back and face your distant destiny, but seek no haven in my shadow. I will give you no hiding place down here. The rock cries out to us today, you may stand upon me, but do not hide your face." Angelou found that writing and reciting poetry was an outlet for her experiences of trauma. And throughout her career, she has written powerful, courageous poetry and prose that speaks her truth and empowers others to do so as well. And yet, this is a risk that not everyone can take. Those who fear retribution, jail time, or deportation may remain silent and not join audibly in the chorus of Me Too. In a recent New Yorker article about Harvey Weinstein and his accusers, the reporter Ronan Farrow wrote, "It's likely that the women who spoke to me have recently felt increasingly emboldened to talk about their experiences because of the way the world has changed regarding issues of sex and power. Many Weinstein employees came forward after years and years of silence, In the words of Pharaoh, because they felt that there was a growing culture of accountability, embodied in the relatively recent disclosures about high-profile men. Now is the right time in this current climate for the truth. And this points to the fourth thing that I'm paying attention to as the Me Too movement unfolds, which is the effect of one, and then two, and then more people breaking the silence. It gives others permission and courage to do so as well. There's a ripple effect. We saw this with the physician to Olympic gymnast, Larry Nassar, who was sentenced just recently. Over the course of decades, he abused over 150 young female patients. But it wasn't until one of these young women, Rachel Den Hollander, shared her story that the other hundreds of women felt like they could speak out. Similarly, in the 5 years after Anita Hill's testimony against Clarence Thomas, the number of sexual harassment filings more than doubled. During the hearings, Anita Hill quoted Justice Louis Brandeis saying, "Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants." When the truth is exposed to the light of day, it has a healing and a cleansing effect, both for the soul and for the power structures. Our prelude today, sung so beautifully by the women of the Sanctuary Choir, includes a phrase in Latin which means, "Receive the light and pass it on. I give that you may give." The effect of speaking up is to shine light on the truth and to pass that light along to others who need that uplift. I give that you may give. I break the silence so that you too may speak out. I came across a poem recently about this ripple effect. It was written not by a famous poet, but by a guy who is a lawyer and just writes and shares his poetry for fun. And I loved the image in it. It spoke of one pebble being tossed into a pond, which causes some small ripples, but once the reactive pond settles, there's a tepid peace, as he writes. The stone rests there on the floor of the pond, waiting, until over time, many pebbles and stones converge to form a mountain that emerges powerfully from the surface of the water. This describes so perfectly what I see at work in our culture today. One voice may produce ripples, but when the initial reactivity ceases, things quiet down to a tepid peace. Yet the voice remains, and when joined by other voices, it is amplified, emerging powerfully within and rising above the once reactive culture. Let's hope that this is the kind of revolution that Lucy Parsons spoke of nearly 100 years ago, happening today. As the Time magazine article reminds us, for the moment, the world is listening. This has not always been the case, and I'm not sure it was even the case a little over a year ago in the midst of the presidential election. At the time, women were speaking out about how they'd been assaulted and harassed by then-candidate Donald Trump. A poll in October 2016 found that 68% of registered voters believed their stories. Only 14% believed that Trump had not made any unwanted sexual advances toward women. So it's not that we didn't hear Trump's accusers, or even that we didn't believe them. We knew that they weren't lying, and we elected him anyway. This is something to come to terms with. What does this mean? And yet now, with the growth of the Me Too movement, I believe that there is a renewed opportunity for truth to be heard and believed and acted on. The world is listening. So what now will we say? What will we say as people who have Me Too stories of our own? What will we say as people of faith? Unitarian Universalists have a history of being silence breakers in some respects and silent keepers in others. The movie that's out now, The Post, brings attention to one of these examples. Our own Beacon Press published the complete Pentagon Papers in 1971, calling out 4 presidential administrations for lying. As a result, the federal government and even Nixon himself used harassment and threats to try to silence Beacon Press and to prevent us from publishing the papers. On the other hand, when our own leaders have been accused of misconduct, sexual or otherwise, there have sometimes been moves to cover it up, to silence the silence breakers, and to preserve reputations. We are much like the rest of society, imperfect people, imperfect institutions, yet with a faithful commitment to speaking the truth and working for justice. Sexual assault and harassment are against our religion. We can proclaim that loud and clear. We support the free and responsible search for truth and meaning in matters of the spirit, in community, and in the struggle for justice. As our banner at the Women's March last week and last year says, First Unitarian Church of Dallas trusts and respects women. We respect your choices, your bodies, your lives, and we trust you when you say, me too. We are not a religion that promotes guilt and shame. We are a religion that says that you are born blessed, that your body is sacred, and that we are all imperfect beings doing our best in an imperfect culture. These statements of faith and values shared by our religious community give me strength and help me to live a life of courage. What about you? What helps to give you strength to break the silence when the silence needs to be broken and to speak up with the truth, or your truth? One of my favorite hymns about summoning the courage and strength to keep on speaking and to keep on singing is entitled "My Life Flows On in Endless Song." What though the tempest round me roars, it says, I know the truth, it liveth. What though the darkness round me close, songs in the night it giveth. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that rock I'm clinging. Since love prevails in heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? Through it all we hear the real though far off hymn that hails a new creation, and tyrants tremble as they hear the bells of freedom ringing. For the silence breakers, risk takers, and justice makers, we give thanks. May we all have the courage to live lives of truth, to use our power for good, and to bring about a new creation in which no one ever again has to say, me too. May it be so. Amen.